Hi, class. Today we're going to talk about the civilizations in the Yellow River Valley. That's our third of the River Valley civilizations, and this one, of course, deals with China. Like the other civilizations, we're going to talk a little geography right now. Ancient China was isolated. There are oceans to the east, of course, the Pacific Ocean. The Gobi Desert, part of Mongolia today, was to the north, which helped isolate and protect the northern flank of the developing Chinese civilization from invasion. And then there are mountains to the west and south. And so China's isolation was significant. It was allowed to develop uninterrupted, unhindered by outside interference. The Yellow and Yangtze rivers here formed a massive corridor for irrigation. Again, much like India, hundreds or about over 1 million square kilometers of irrigable land. Of course, brace yourselves, river flooding was a problem, but again, they developed agricultural means to counter that. Now, of course, their staple crop was rice. Now, we don't know exactly when the first civilization in China developed. Chinese legend has it that the Zhou Dynasty, and I'm going to apologize now for mispronouncing most of the Chinese words in this presentation. The mistakes are mine, nobody else's. My apologies. The Zhou Dynasty is the legendary dynasty. There's no historical evidence that it actually existed, but legend has it that it was right there in that kind of elbow of the river, and that King Yu was their legendary founder, kind of like a Chinese King Narmer from Egypt. Again, a semi-mythical, well, in this case, completely mythical character who was a demigod who basically designed irrigation projects and flood control, managed the rivers, tamed the rivers, which of course led to civilization as the population grew, cities emerged, etc. Now, what we do know, historically speaking, is that the Shang Dynasty, that ran almost 800 years, from 1800 to 1027 BC, there's historical evidence that this civilization actually existed. It's the first dynasty confirmed in the historical record, and we've got several sources for that information. First, the archaeological record. We've got copious amounts of artifacts that have come down to us from the past. Oracle bones, which are actually a fascinating subject. This is a turtle shell, a tortoise shell, and they were used for divination, to tell the future. And what the ancient Chinese seers did was they would write predictions on different parts of the shell, and then one would come in, say, hey, I want to know whether I should marry this person or that person. And so they'd write a series of predictions, heat up the tortoise shell, and then how it cracked, how it split under heat would be the divination. That would be the prediction for the future. This is what you should do based on this idea. And of course, writing. We have translation of the Shang Dynasty's writing. It was a early form of modern Chinese. So with those three sources in hand, we have a pretty good idea of what was going on in the Shang Dynasty. Suffice to say that this was a settling society. They maintained a military, specialized workers, to fight against the nomadic steppe people that occupied the Gobi Desert region, and also that lived along the foothills to the mountains to the west. Now, interestingly enough, the king ruled the rural areas, while the nobles ruled the semi-independent city-states. And what I'd like you to do, pause the video and write down in the Google Doc, or in the Google form that accompanies this, the answer to that question: why did the king control the rural lands and leave the city-states to the nobility? I'm interested in what you have to say about that, because it's a pretty clear-cut reason why. Okay? Okay, now I assume you're back. You're done pausing the video and writing down your answer, so let's continue. The Shang Dynasty was very hierarchical, very patriarchal, and very warlike. Historians believe they were herders. They had been herders that were settling into that agricultural lifestyle that's critical for civilization to take, so to speak. Another interesting factor to consider, based on the writings that we have, is the fact that the individual really didn't matter much. It was all about the family. It was all about a group. What it was of the family, the king, the state. The group was primacy. Family was supreme. Ancestor worship was common. The belief that the spirits of the ancestors occupied the house and you had to pay them respect. They weren't gods. I hasten to add, they weren't gods. They were more like, the people you had to take care of to make sure that you stayed on their good side, because it could bring you good or bad luck. Since the Chinese were isolated, they had to be self-sufficient. Trade was not an option. Unlike Mesopotamia, unlike India, their isolation was pretty much complete. The Chinese isolation was pretty much complete. They didn't have trade partners with whom to trade. So if they didn't make it, they didn't have it. Now, technologically speaking, their bronze metallurgy, the Shang Dynasty is known for their bronze metallurgy. It was astonishingly advanced. They introduced iron casting relatively late in the dynasty in the 1200s, and it, based on the bronze techniques that they had developed, their iron casting was phenomenal. It was further along than anything that would happen in Europe from the Roman Empire on up through the Middle Ages. So plate mail and all that kind of thing. The Chinese had led the world in this regard. They used chariots, in militarily speaking. Their writing system was pictographic, much like cuneiform, much like the hieroglyphics that we've talked about in the past. So there was over 10,000 symbols, 10,000 characters in the language. You needed to know 1,500 just to be barely literate. And as we've talked about with the Phoenicians, I think that this should remind you of how important an alphabet is to the development of civilization, or excuse me, the development of the written language. Pictographic languages necessarily kept the amount of literate people to a minimum because of the necessity to memorize so many different symbols, discrete symbols for a particular word or concept. Modern written Chinese, the modern written Chinese language is a direct descendant of this ancient language. Of course, modern Chinese now incorporates a phonetic component, but this language helped unify a large, diverse culture. Now, if you could remind me in the Google form about how an empire is unified, just write down how a unified language could help unify a large, diverse group of people. Just answer the prompt in the Google form. Don't worry. If you pause it, I'll still be here waiting for you. Okay, we're back, and let's keep talking about the Shang. The religion, again, I mentioned it was ancestor worship. If the ancestors were not respected, if they were not shown deference, they would bring a person bad luck. The Shang believed in an afterlife. Kings were buried with many valuable items, including living servants. They were buried alive. Some of them were buried with their heads cut off. This picture up here is essentially they lifted a part of a Shang Dynasty tomb, and you can see the bodies, the headless bodies that we presume were of servants that were entombed with their king. Human sacrifice was resorted to so that spirits would stay happy. Yes, they practiced human sacrifice in the Shang Dynasty. Now, the Zhou Dynasty succeeded the Shang Dynasty. The Zhou were a nomadic people that came in, overthrew, and then absorbed, and frankly were absorbed by Shang culture. Now, interestingly enough, the Zhou bring in this concept called the Mandate of Heaven. It was kind of a justification for their overthrow of the Shang Dynasty and taking over the Shang Dynasty. In this Mandate of Heaven, the Zhou argued, look, rulers were the son of heaven, and they governed by divine right. If a ruler was dethroned, overthrown, that showed that he had lost the blessings of all the gods to rule. Okay, well, leading up to that, even if the king had not lost, or had not lost his throne, bad things happening in society, floods, famine, droughts, invasions, were a sign that the ruler was losing divine support, and thus a justification for the people to rise up against the king, to revolt and overthrow their king. And the theory thus explained and justified the demise of the Xia, this legendary dynasty, justified the fall of the Shang, and supported the legitimacy of the present and future rulers of China, all the way down to the communist Chinese that took over China in 1949. So this Mandate of Heaven is a really important idea that will kind of stick with us through the class. Whenever we talk about the Chinese, we're going to end up talking about the Mandate of Heaven. This is I'd like to think it's a useful flow of the dynastic cycle. The Mandate of Heaven is also referred to as the dynastic cycle. The Mandate of Heaven is the idea that the gods designate somebody, and then if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, the gods will demonstrate their displeasure by removing their mandate, removing their approval. And this dynastic cycle, a new dynasty comes to power. Each step is the positive, and then bad things start to happen. The emperor's defeated. It starts a new dynasty, and you can see the cycle can cycle through over centuries, of course, or over decades. The Zhou Dynasty was a more centralized system of government. They transitioned from the Shang city-states to a more centralized government. The Zhou exercised much greater control over local government affairs as well, which is important to recognize. Their technology, they built a lot of roads, transportation. As their state, centralized state, grew larger, they needed to cover more ground, make sure their military could get to where it needed to be. So they built a lot of roads, canals. They coined money, which of course helped spur trade. And one more time, I'd like you to write in your Google form, answer the prompt: why or how does coined money spur trade over a barter system? Okay, pause it, answer the question, then come on back. Great. Iron casting was also a big advance. They had regularized iron casting. The Shang had started with it and developed it quickly. The Zhou really regularized it. And again, Europe took thousands of years to catch up. Pretty remarkable. The Zhou fell to nomads. Nomads from the north and west sacked the capital, killed the king, and the Zhou state broke up as nobles asserted their local power, refusing to be ruled by the surviving members of the royal family. And values collapsed during this time period. A sense of being Chinese collapsed. This was referred to as the time of warring states, a very significant time period in history in China that we will come back to in a couple weeks. Thanks very much. See you tomorrow.